Today we're testing more games on Apple M1. On screen you can see the Macs that we tested some of these games on. Check out applesilicongames.com for a detailed list of compatible games on Apple Silicon machines. The link is in the description. First, let's have a look at some games updated for Apple M1, or otherwise known as ARM64. Here we have Asphalt 8, a classic arcade racing title. Originally a mobile game, Gameloft ported Asphalt 8 to the App Store as a universal app last year. The Mac or M1 version here showcases the game at its best state, with a stable 60 FPS across all M1 models, higher resolution support, improved textures, and external peripheral support for mouse and keyboard and controllers. Weirdly, Asphalt 9 has not been updated for native M1 support. Hopefully, this comes next. Recently, a number of Apple Arcade games have been optimized for Mac with M1. I've spoken to most of the developers for these games, and they have informed me that 60 FPS is supported at native resolution, and for the ones with custom graphics such as Populous Run and Spaceland, you can play at their highest quality. Yes, these are not the most high-end games, but as I said previously, it's good to see small teams or indie games being updated for M1. It means that porting your game to M1 is not just limited to big video game development studios. At first I thought Alien Isolation was unplayable on Apple M1, as it was stuck at around 10 FPS. I wanted to show it in the very first episode. However, after playing around with some settings for this video, I discovered that enabling SSAO completely destroys the performance here. SSAO is enabled by default, so I imagine many of you will launch this game and go, what the heck is going on, and then immediately quit without going in and configuring the settings. With SSAO off, on our 13-inch MacBook Pro, we played at 1600 by 900, otherwise known as 900p, and we had a mix of medium and high settings, which allowed for the smoothest frame rate. On Mac Mini, we decided to play at a resolution of 1920 by 1080, 1080p, with all the settings set to medium. The performance here is not going to blow anyone away, considering Alien Isolation can get respectable performance on much older Mac hardware. In fact, the game is officially supported on some Mac models back to 2012. But let's not forget, this is an OpenGL game running under Rosetta 2. If it was optimized for M1, I'm sure it would match Macs with dedicated graphics. Also, Feral Interactive recently ported this game to Nintendo Switch, and in a recent interview with Touch Arcade, a potential Alien Isolation mobile port was discussed, but very briefly. So maybe an update for M1 is a possibility. A Plague Tale: Innocence is a 2019 action-adventure. It is playable on M1 under Parallels. As we all know, Parallels now supports DirectX 11, which this game supports. The gameplay you see here was provided by Andrew Tsai on YouTube. He's the guy who also uploads many awesome videos on Apple Silicon. He is playing the game at 1080p resolution, low settings, and it looks to get around 30 FPS on average. However, during challenging scenarios, it will drop. The game requires at least 8 GB of memory and a 2 GB graphics card on Windows PC. Here, it is running under emulation with 4 cores and 4 GB of RAM assigned to the VirtualBox, so I'm impressed that it's at least somewhat playable here. I showcased BioShock 2 Remastered in our first M1 video, but BioShock Remastered is worth taking a look at for a few reasons. For starters, its performance is amazing here, even if it's just a remaster of a 2007 game. It gets well over 100 FPS on our 13-inch MacBook Pro and Mac Mini at max settings with VSync switched off. BioShock Remastered was also the first blockbuster game to support the MacBook Pro's Touch Bar in 2017. On the Touch Bar, you can switch between your plasmids, or if you don't know what that means, your superpowers, such as Electro Bolt, Hypnotize Big Daddy, Incinerate, and Telekinesis. This RPG, The Bard's Tale 4 Director's Cut, is a fairly demanding game, especially for Mac. The graphics are evocative, at least as far as the environments are concerned, and during combat, advanced on-screen effects occur all over the place. Our Mac Mini with 16GB of memory could handle the Ultra Graphics preset at 900p resolution, while our 13-inch MacBook Pro was best played at 1080p high, and the MacBook Air was best played at 1080p medium settings. For some reason, the Steam FPS counter isn't working here. This appears to be a reoccurring issue with games running under Unreal Engine 4. And we found that MacBooks will get quite hot, but the game manages to stick to 60 FPS on average across all our M1 machines. I recently discovered that Counter-Strike Global Offensive is now playable on M1 machines. Before macOS Big Sur 11.2, CSGO was having issues that would prevent it from going past the intro scene. Anyway, now that we got our hands on it, our MacBook Pro at 1080p high, the frame rate would range anywhere from 60 up to 80 at times. Playing it low, it could go anywhere from 70 to over 100 FPS at times. On our MacBook Air, we saw around 60 at high and near 80 on low. This was a stupid idea, but I wanted to see if VR worked on M1. Well, it doesn't. The original HTC Vive headset and SteamVR were supported on Intel Macs for a few years. I actually collaborated with HTC Australia to review this technology back in 2018, and that was on a 15-inch MacBook Pro with a Blackmagic eGPU connected. However, only a handful of Steam games decided to support Mac, and then in 2020, Valve decided to end macOS support for VR. macOS users can still download the drivers and then opt into the SteamVR macOS branches for access to legacy builds. This works on Intel Macs just fine. However, as I said, on M1, it simply won't work. Unless Valve decide to provide ARM64 drivers, the current drivers just won't function under Rosetta 2. This isn't all terrible news, however, as there are strong rumors that Apple are working on new AR and VR technology coming in 2022. In the last episode, we had a look at GTA 5 running under Parallels 16. For this episode, let's see how GTA 4 fares on M1. Andrew Tsai has once again provided footage from his MacBook Air. To get the game working, please note, you have to install DirectX Web Runtime and update your Windows ARM build. Playing at 1080p and medium settings, the frame rate sticks mostly to around 30 FPS, sometimes dropping into the low 20s. The game also has issues with shadows flickering, but you have to be looking very closely to notice it. The Elder Scrolls Online is one of the few games on Mac with support for the Vulkan API, along with Dota 2 and Path of Exile. The Steam FPS counter is not working for this game, but thankfully you can enable an in-game FPS counter by pressing / and then typing FPS. At medium settings on our 13-inch MacBook Pro and MacBook Air, the frame rate is in the high 30s for the most part. On high, it's sticking closer to 30. There was a random texture bug that occurred once, but I never noticed it again. And some character textures took a while to load. Furthermore, some of you may be having issues with the camera spinning like crazy. This is an issue with macOS Big Sur and not the game itself, so to fix this, you have to give the game permission to control your computer from security and privacy under settings. I've included a link for this fix in the description. SUPERHOT Mind Control Delete is the third game in the groundbreaking, action-packed, slow-mo shooter franchise. It can run on most Macs back to 2012, as it only requires a Mac graphics card with 1024 megabytes of memory. So, it's no surprise it's working here. I've got the Epic Store version here, so I can't track the FPS, but if I was to guess, it's hanging around 60 FPS. The only other thing to note is that my controller was not working, and the game took a number of minutes to open the pre-game launcher. Dark Souls Remastered runs really well on M1. All this is running under crossover 20. On Andrew Tsai's MacBook Air, he is running it at 1080p max settings and it looks to get around 60 FPS. A high frame rate is very good for this type of game as every frame matters during combat. It's Thief, the classic action-adventure from 2014. It has a handy benchmark mode that we can use. At the low-quality preset, our MacBook Pro is getting 34.2 FPS. On Mac Mini, 24.1 FPS. On MacBook Air, 25.5. At medium, 34.1 on MacBook Pro, which is not really any different. 25.6 on Mac Mini, which is weird. And 24.9 on MacBook Air. And finally, at high, 27.8 on MacBook Pro, 21.5 on Mac Mini, and 20.9 on MacBook Air. Honestly, I don't know why the MacBook Air and Mac Mini are performing quite a bit worse than the MacBook Pro, because really they should be kind of equal. Most modern Mac games now support the Metal API, but for some reason Crusader Kings III is sadly running under OpenGL. This may be a significant factor in its poor performance. At any graphics preset, the frame rate was anywhere from 15 to 40 FPS. If you want to play Crusader Kings III on your M1 Mac, you should still have an okay experience, as in my opinion, this game doesn't really benefit from a dramatically high frame rate, if that makes sense. CARRION gets well over 500 FPS on Apple M1. This is not really a surprise, I guess, as CARRION is just a 2D action game. Most Mac screens are 60Hz unless you have an external monitor, so the high frame rate isn't really going to be that noticeable, I guess. The only thing to note is that my controller was not working. You should really try out this game. CARRION is an oddly satisfying game all about reverse horror. It's really cool. Most new LEGO games feature impressive graphics and effects from gameplay and cinematics, and a rich color palette and advanced LEGO animations. On Mac, LEGO The Incredibles requires a 2GB AMD Radeon M290 or Intel Iris Pro 5200. For our 13-inch MacBook Pro M1, it was best to play the game at 900p to enjoy all the settings at their max quality. Fallout 4 has been highly requested by you guys. Well, I can report it runs incredibly well on Andrew Tsai's MacBook Air via crossover. At 1080p medium settings, Andrew said the world feels like around 30 to 40 FPS, and in combat it drags down to around 20 to 30 FPS. There are minor graphical issues, but none that seem to be game breaking or immersion breaking. There are a few fixes to get the game working here. To help, I've included Andrew Tsai's YouTube video in the video description for Fallout 4. Not much needs to be said about Factorio. It gets 60 FPS at all times. However, I have no idea how to play this game, and I don't have time to learn, unfortunately. In a previous M1 video, we tested F1 2017, but I didn't want to forget F1 2016. After all, it was Feral Interactive's first game to support the Metal API on Mac. Even though it's pretty old now, it still requires a powerful Intel Mac to enjoy it. You need a 2GB AMD R9 M290 or a 2GB NVIDIA 680MX or a 1.5GB Intel Iris 540. So how does M1 fare on a 6-year-old game? Well, at the medium quality preset, our MacBook Pro is getting 50 FPS. On Mac Mini, 30, we'll come back to that. And on a MacBook Air, 42. And at high, 44 on MacBook Pro, 30 on Mac Mini, 36 on MacBook Air. Look, we are unsure why the Mac Mini was stuck at 30 because we did have VSync at an interval of 1, but it might just be a specific issue with this model. F1 2016 is running on an older version of the Metal API, so that could explain the mixed performance results. In the original macOS Big Sur and macOS Big Sur version 1.1, this fantastic RPG, Pathfinder Kingmaker Enhanced Plus Edition, a long name, it had terrible performance, getting around 20 FPS on average at medium settings. But in version 1.2, we can play it high and get 40 to 50 FPS, which is a significant improvement. The game itself hasn't been updated, so it must be something inside the macOS Big Sur update that improves performance in some games. This is a very underrated gem. It's a good adventure with an interesting story filled with complicated companions and romances. But you must know the puzzles are just as challenging as the fights, if not more so. I remember back in 2016, Moto Racer 4 was completely broken on Mac. It had terrible performance, even on Macs with dedicated graphics. Since then, it's been better optimized for Intel, and on M1 running under Rosetta, it plays just fine. Despite Steam saying it's a 32-bit game, and it taking around 3 minutes to launch the first time, it is very playable. At 1080p high settings, the frame rate looks to be 60 FPS with no hiccups with performance. The Steam FPS counter is not working here, sadly. I don't know why, but the game still has terrible keyboard controls, which you can't configure easily, and controller support is not working. Anyway, I thought I would include the game to show that it is now more playable on Mac than when compared to a few years back. Celeste is not working on M1 right now. However, as I discovered from a lovely user online, you need to update a couple components of the game's engine that are outdated. I've included a video tutorial in the description if you're interested in playing the game. Once you update Celeste, it plays perfectly fine. After all, it can run on most Macs out there anyway. I just can't get away from Madeline's evil reflection. Aragami is not a very high-spec game, only requiring 4GB of memory and a 2GB GPU on Intel Macs. On my M1 MacBook Pro, I had to lower the resolution to 900p to get a decent frame rate. It's perfectly playable here, and very enjoyable, but I hope they update it for Mac in the future, as it should be able to handle 1080p. If you're hoping Aragami 2 is coming to Mac, I asked the developer on Twitter, and they replied saying, for now, it's not in our plans to release Aragami 2 for Mac. I hope this changes, as I really love the first game, with its really smart approach to the stealth genre. On Steam, it says Outlast 2 is a 32-bit game. However, this is false, and the game is playable in M1. Please, developers, mark your games as 64-bit compatible with macOS Catalina or Big Sur, as many people will skip your games. On our 13-inch MacBook Pro and MacBook Air, it gets around 50 to 60 FPS when at medium settings, but can dip down lower. For an OpenGL title, I think the performance is still kind of decent here. I do wonder though if we'll ever see Outlast 2 on Mac. The Sims 2 is my favourite game in the series by far. I have so many fond memories playing this game on my old iMac G5, creating a family and watching everyone grow old and bring new life. It was awesome. Anyway, I don't recommend you play this on M1 right now, as it keeps crashing to the desktop. It usually occurs when I'm interacting with menus or changing graphics settings. Aspyr did recently update the game from 32-bit to 64-bit and brought Metal API support, so I imagine they will update it for Apple Silicon in the future too. PAYDAY 2 runs okay on MacBook Air via Crossover 20, but with some graphical glitches. But overall, it appears to be, playable. A few of you wanted to see Yooka-Laylee in one of these videos, so here you go. So at 1080p, fantastic quality, it gets around 40 to 50 FPS. Lowering the graphics preset does nothing to improve performance. In fact, in some cases, it can be the opposite. Weird. The Long Dark does just fine on M1. Mind you, I really don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know how to play this game. It's running under OpenGL, so the frame rate is not bad considering. Our last game is a fantastic 2D action platformer, Skul, the Hero Slayer. As you'd expect, it has no issues with performance. Only caveat is that controller support is not working. Please don't judge this game because of the 2D graphics. It's great, with lots of replay value and a nice little story packaged in there. What do you think of Apple M1? Are you impressed or disappointed with the performance that you've seen so far? Are you now just waiting for more games to be available on this platform? Let me know what you're thinking in the comments. I'm honestly not sure how many more of these episodes I can make, considering I've tested most notable games available natively on Mac. My next episode might not be until the next Apple Silicon chips come out. We'll just see how that goes. For now, let's hope more developers take this new technology more seriously. Anyway, leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe and turn on notifications to stay up to date with everything Mac gaming related. My name is Stewie, and thanks for watching.